Once, in a time when giants still walked the earth, there lived one whose pride reached higher than the mountains of his land. His name was Og, king of Bashan, a man so large his bed had to be made of iron, not for comfort, but because wood could no longer carry the weight of his body or his pride. What happens when a man believes he's too big, even for God? Og was not just a warrior. He was a monument, a remnant of an ancient world where power ruled and fear kept order. His throne stood atop carved stones and rituals older than memory. His people didn't merely serve him, they feared him, revered him, called him divine. But this is not the story of a king at the height of his glory. This is the story of a fall, of the last of the Rephaim, the giant who dared to defy Moses and stand against the living God. Because what brought Og down wasn't an army. It wasn't Israel's numbers or swords. It was something he couldn't see, something he couldn't understand, something he couldn't stop, a presence. Not wind, not sound, but the holy hush that comes before judgment. A weight not felt on skin, but on the soul. A divine pressure he couldn't name, but couldn't deny. The night before the battle, something shifted. The skies darkened, the wind turned, even the wild animals fled the hills. And from across the valley, the camp of Israel echoed, not with the clamor of soldiers, but with the sound of worship. And that night, for the first time in his life, Og, the most feared man in the land, could not sleep, because what approached that night was more than an enemy. It was a reckoning, so stay with me. Because the fall of this giant isn't just an ancient story, it's a warning, a mirror, and a reminder that no throne built on pride can stand when God himself steps onto the field. Long before Israel crossed the Jordan, before Moses raised his staff or Joshua whispered a prayer, there was Bashan, a land of shadows and stone, where cliffs pierced the sky and ancient trees whispered names long forgotten. And towering above it all was a man born not just of flesh, but of legend, Og, king of Bashan. But he was not always a king. He began as a child among the hills, walking beside his father through basalt caverns and groves carved by time. His people were descendants of the Rephaim, giants not just in size, but in legacy. They were the last echoes of an age when men bowed to no god but their own strength. Og's father once told him, "Strength is a gift, but it becomes a curse when it refuses to kneel." Those words stayed with him, until they didn't. As Og grew, so did his hunger, not just for territory, but for permanence. He carved roads into mountains. He raised fortresses so high they swallowed the sun, and when wood cracked beneath his weight, he ordered a bed of iron to be forged, not for rest, but for display. His people called him the living pillar, thunder of the north, even son of the watchers. And Og believed it. He laughed at stories of Israel, slaves turned wanderers, following a prophet and a pillar of cloud. What could they possibly know of power? He sat on his iron throne, lifted goblets of wine, and dismissed them as desert fanatics, fairy tales with sandals. But deep in the valleys, the rumors spread, of seas parting, of plagues in Egypt, of a people who marched without chariots, yet cities fell before them, of a prophet who vanished into fire, and a new leader whose silence spoke louder than swords. Og tried to ignore it, until one night a scout returned, barely breathing, dust in his mouth, blood on his tunic, eyes wide with something Og hadn't seen before. Terror. "They march, and they sing," the man whispered. Og forced a smile, but something in him, something buried beneath stone, pride and armor, tightened. That night, as wind howled through the empty halls of his palace, Og stood alone. And though the fires still burned bright, the giant king of Bashan felt, for the first time, the chill of something eternal drawing near. In Bashan, giants did not tremble, but now the silence was different. It wasn't peace, it was pressure. The kind that builds just before something breaks. The rumors came like dust on the wind, light at first, easy to ignore. A merchant's servant spoke of it, then a soldier's cousin, then a wandering priest who returned pale, trembling. All said the same thing. They're coming. But this was no ordinary army, no siege towers, no war drums, no polished horses. They walked like men who had already won. Some spoke of a sea that opened, of an empire swallowed whole without a single sword raised. Others told of a prophet who climbed a mountain and returned glowing. And now a new leader had taken his place. Not a warlord, not a king, a man named Joshua. Og scoffed. "We are Bashan," he said. "Let Canaan tremble. We do not bow to wind and stories." But the stories kept coming. Jericho had fallen, its walls collapsed by sound. The kings of the Amorites had vanished. And Israel? They sang, not with battle chants, not with rage, but with worship. Their voices didn't demand victory, they declared it. A scout returned, wounded, whispering, "My king." Their leader does not shout. He stands still, and yet it feels as though the wind itself waits for his command. Another said, "They walk without fear, because they believe they are not alone." Og grew restless. He summoned his priests. They burned incense and cast lots, but the air remained heavy, the sky unsettled. He struck one of his generals when he asked, "What if their God is real?" But late at night, alone in his chambers, Og looked to the east and wondered, what kind of army walks without weapons drawn? What kind of people prepare for war by singing? And why? Why did the darkness seem thinner near their camp? He thought again of his father's voice. Giants fall hardest when they bow to no one. But Og had bowed to nothing. No man, no God, no warning. Still, something in his bones whispered, this is no ordinary battle. Something holy was moving, and it would not stop for thrones, crowns, or giants. The fires of Bashan burned higher than ever that night. Torches lined every wall. Drums pounded through the courtyards. Tables overflowed with meat and wine. To the eye, it was a celebration, a display of strength before the storm, but on the throne of iron. Og was quiet. He lifted his goblet with the same hand that once tore through enemy lines, but the grip was different now, not weaker, just uncertain. The feast continued, yet his eyes drifted beyond the stone columns, beyond the smoke, to the horizon. There, across the valley, the camp of Israel stood still. No fires raged, no blades gleamed, only faint voices rising like incense, singing. A captain approached. "My king," he said hesitantly, "they don't prepare like we do. They don't shout. They don't sharpen swords. They read, they sing, they pray." Og didn't answer. He thought of the iron bed beneath him, 13 feet long, forged not for rest, but to remind the world of his strength. But tonight it felt colder, heavier, less like a monument, more like a weight. He stood and left the hall, walking alone along the upper wall of his fortress. The wind was sharp, the stars hidden behind clouds, the land below silent. Yet something moved, not a sound, but a presence, not fear, but something deeper, conviction. He had mocked their stories, laughed at their songs, dismissed their God as a myth. But now, as worship rose from Israel's tents, Og, the giant king, felt something grip his soul, not a sword, not a curse, but truth. This was no war of nations. This was a reckoning, a moment written long before Og was born. Back in his chamber, he unsheathed his great sword, longer than most men were tall. It had won him cities, it had crushed kings, but in his hands now, it felt wrong, as if it no longer belonged to him. He looked east again, and in the darkness whispered a prayer, not to God, but to silence itself. If I fall, let them remember I stood. But the silence gave no answer, only the wind, and the presence that drew nearer with every breath. The dawn didn't break gently, it split the sky. The sun rose over Bashan like a sword drawn from heaven, sharp, burning, silent. But the usual sounds of morning were gone. No birds, no breeze, just stillness. Even the animals had vanished. Og stood on the walls of Edrei, watching the valley below. His warriors, thousands of them, were ready. Swords polished, armor strapped, shields lined like iron waves across the field. But none of them cheered. Because Israel had come. Not with catapults, not with battle cries, but with silence. A line of men walked forward in unbroken formation. No chariots, no trumpets, no fear. And then, rising like thunder beneath the surface of the world, came their voices. Worship, not noise, not threats, but reverence. Faith turned into sound. Og felt it before he understood it. The pressure in the air, the trembling beneath the stone, a heaviness not caused by numbers, but by holiness. One of his priests gasped, "My king, heaven is watching." Og said nothing, because he knew. This was not just an army approaching, this was the presence of God. Then he saw him, Joshua, not marching, not shouting, just standing, his staff in hand, his eyes steady, his posture firm, and behind him, though unseen, was a power Og could no longer deny. The sword in Og's hand suddenly felt unfamiliar. It resisted him, as if refusing to rise. His breath caught. His heart raced, but not with courage, with conviction. And then the wind shifted. It swept through the valley like a divine breath, lifting dust, bending trees, pulling the sky downward in silence. No trumpet sounded, no spear flew. But the earth held its breath. For just a moment, all of creation paused, as if waiting for a command not from man, but from heaven. Og gritted his teeth, not out of anger, but out of dread. He had mocked this God. Now he stood on holy ground. And Bashan, with all its stone, its pride, its iron and roar, trembled, because the God of Israel had arrived, and Og, once the terror of nations, stood not before men, but before the Almighty. Og stood at the gates of Edrei. No crown, no armor, only a sword too heavy and a silence too loud. Behind him, his warriors waited, not with confidence, but confusion. The drums of Bashan had gone quiet. The fires no longer roared. Even the wind seemed to stop just short of the fortress walls. Across the valley, the Israelites no longer marched. They stood still, every face turned toward Og's stronghold, every voice hushed, except one, Joshua. He now walked forward, alone. No shield, no blade, just the steady steps of a man who knew he wasn't walking alone. Behind him moved no soldiers, but a presence, invisible, immovable. And Og felt it in his bones. He could charge, he could strike, he could swing the sword that had made kingdoms bow. But when he raised it, his arms betrayed him. The strength he had always trusted, the strength that once shattered walls and tore through flesh, no longer answered him. His grip faltered, his knees shook, his sword dropped, not by force, by something deeper, conviction. He looked into Joshua's eyes, and there was no fear, no hatred, only truth. Og saw it then, clearer than the peaks of Bashan or the scars on his body. This moment was never about Israel. It wasn't about swords or kings. It was about pride. His pride meeting the holiness of God. The walls of Bashan had not yet crumbled, but they no longer listened to his voice. The iron throne behind him felt colder than stone, not a seat of power, but a tomb of pride. And the sky, still silent, but no longer distant. Joshua raised his hand, not to strike, but to seal what heaven had already decreed. The earth trembled, not from war machines, but from the weight of judgment. The cracks in Bashan began from within. Og took one step, not to fight, not to flee, but to fall. He dropped to his knees, his hands once unshakable, now open and empty, his breath shallow, his face to the ground. And the giant fell, not to a sword, not to a man, but to the presence of the God he had once mocked. The last of the Rephaim was no longer standing, because when holiness arrives, no flesh can boast. The battlefield was still, no cries of triumph, no songs of conquest, only silence, heavy and holy. The gates of Bashan hung open, shattered not by siege engines, but by surrender. The iron throne stood untouched, its shadow long and cold, and Og was gone. But the weight of what had happened lingered in the air like smoke after fire. The people of Bashan emerged slowly, eyes wide, hearts uncertain. They looked not to Joshua, not to the Israelites, but to the empty space where their king had stood. The one who was supposed to be unshakable had fallen without a blade being raised. Og's sword lay in the dirt, half buried, unclaimed. His bed of iron still stood, silent and bare beneath the broken roof. It no longer declared power. It whispered a warning. An elder priest, trembling, broke the silence. "Leave it," he said. "Let the world remember what happens when man builds without fear of God." And they did. Israel did not loot. They did not dance or boast. They walked through Bashan with reverence, heads bowed, eyes low. This was not their glory. This was God's judgment. Even the land responded. The skies cleared. The trees stilled. The animals returned, as if the air itself had been lifted, as if the weight of arrogance had been rolled away. The once mighty cities of Bashan would not be rebuilt. No new king would rise from Og's ashes. His people dispersed, his legacy dissolved, not in fire, but in silence. Because what fell that day was not just a man, but an idea. That strength can stand on its own. That pride makes a better foundation than faith. For generations the Israelites would remember it, not as a victory of men, but as a moment when heaven stepped in. The story would be told again and again, not of Og the ruler, but Og the warning. And from his ruins, one truth would echo. No fortress is too strong, no throne too high, no king too mighty, that the Lord cannot humble him in a single breath. After all the noise faded, after the dust settled and the warriors had vanished, one object remained untouched. Og's bed, iron, immense, cold, 13 feet long, nearly 6 feet wide, too massive for comfort, too heavy for any ordinary man. It had been forged as a monument, not to rest, but to intimidate, to say, "Here lies one who is beyond comparison." Scripture would record its size, not to glorify Og, but to remember what kind of pride God had brought down. Because now that very bed stood beneath an open sky, its canopy gone, its chamber crumbled. And Og? Nowhere. The bed had become a relic, not of greatness, but of arrogance. It had once been his throne, his symbol, his proof that he was more than a man. And now, it was a grave, not of his body, but of his legacy. Israel didn't take it. They didn't melt it down or carry it off in triumph. They left it because some things are not meant to be trophies. They're meant to be warnings. And that bed, still standing though the king had fallen, spoke louder than any song. It reminded every passerby, every child, every warrior. This is where pride sleeps. This is what remains when a man builds without God. Og's sword had rusted. His crown had vanished. His walls were broken, but the bed stayed. Not because it was strong, but because God allowed it to endure as a message, not to inspire fear, but awe. Awe of the one who doesn't need armies to bring down kingdoms, who doesn't need swords to break strongholds, who humbles the mighty not by shouting, but by showing them who truly rules. And every time the wind passed through the ruins of Bashan, every time someone paused to stare at that lonely frame of iron, they remembered, God does not forget pride, and those who exalt themselves will be brought low. When giants fall, the earth remembers, not because of the noise they make when they hit the ground, but because of what their fall reveals. Og of Bashan wasn't just a giant in size. He was a mirror, a warning wrapped in flesh and iron. He stood for every kingdom built on pride, every man who trusted in what he could build, command, or measure. And in one moment, without blade or arrow, that image was shattered. Why? Because God had arrived. Og defied Moses. He dismissed the God of Israel as a desert myth. He trusted in height, in iron, in legacy. But all of it, his strength, his sword, his throne, crumbled before a presence he couldn't see, but could no longer resist. And isn't that still true today? How many of us build lives on our own iron beds? Careers, reputations, control, measurable things we think will last forever. But if God is not the builder, those walls will fall. We put our faith in the visible, but God moves through what is unseen. Israel didn't defeat Og with numbers. They didn't need siege towers or clever strategies. They marched in silence. They sang in faith. And because of that, God fought for them. That's what the story of Bashan teaches us. Not just that giants fall, but that only God stands forever. So when you walk through valleys where the opposition looks too big, too loud, too powerful, remember this. It's not about how strong your enemy is. It's about who walks with you. Og was brought down, not by men, but by the holy weight of righteousness. And that same power still walks with those who trust in the Lord today. So ask yourself, what iron beds have you built in your life? What thrones of pride have you defended? And what will you do when God comes walking through your Bashan? Because when giants fall, it's not the sound that matters. It's the silence that follows, the moment when only one is left standing. The one who always has, the one who always will, because when the throne falls silent, the voice of God is all that remains.